Hi, I'm Colby, and I love painting with watercolor. If you are here to learn watercolor with me today, we are in for a treat because I am going to paint two different style Misty Forests just like this one. These are some of my most popular designs on my Instagram account, This Writing Desk, and so I am so excited to share with you my methods for painting this ridge line of Misty Forest, both in this gradient style like this and in this color blend style. So if this sounds like something fun, then keep watching. Okay, before embarking on any painting that requires blending colors, it's important to A, pick out the colors that you want to use, but also B, run some tests on the colors before painting your actual piece. So for my Misty Forest, I chose Paraline Violet, and this is a tube of Schminky watercolor paint, lavender, wisteria, and phthalo turquoise. So these three are Daniel Smith. This one is Schminky. All of these are professional grade watercolor paint and some of my very favorite shades. So I know that I love all of these colors separately and potentially all of them together, but before I actually paint and blend them in my Misty Forest, I need to make sure that they blend well together. And if they don't, which ones don't, so that they don't touch each other in the actual project. So first I'm gonna do a test of lavender and wisteria. And the way that we do this is use the wet on wet technique to do some blending tests. So first I'm gonna paint a wet swatch of lavender, and then while lavender is still wet, grab the wisteria and blend it into the lavender to see what the resulting color is going to be. And surprise, surprise, that color is really just a different color of purple, and it looks really great. So we know that wisteria and lavender blend well together. Now let's try, if we're starting with lavender first, let's try lavender with Paraline Violet. So grabbing some lavender and some Paraline Violet and doing the same test to see what the end result is. Paraline Violet is a little stronger than lavender, and so I'm just going to do some manual mixing over here. And that is a beautiful color as well. So we know that lavender and Paraline Violet work well together. Now let's test lavender and phthalo turquoise. After I do each swatch, I am cleaning off my brush in between. It doesn't immediately pop up with a muddy brown color, but let's do some manual mixing again like we did with Paraline Violet just to make sure. Okay, that looks great. So it looks like lavender mixed with all of the other three colors blend really well. So we know that lavender can touch any of the colors in our order and be just fine. Now let's test wisteria. We've already tested wisteria with lavender, so we really only need to test it with Paraline Violet and turquoise. So here's our Paraline Violet test. And at first glance, it looks like they blend together pretty well, which is perfect. And now let's test the phthalo turquoise. Awesome. It also looks like it comes up with just this cool dusky blue. Okay, so wisteria blends well with all of the colors. And now let's test Perylene Violet with Phthalo Turquoise, I believe is the last combination. Let's see what happens. Both of these are kind of darker colors, so it might be harder to see what the result is. We blend it down, it just looks like a darker purple. Okay, so that was the results of this experiment were favorable. Basically, it means that if any of the colors touch each other, they're going to look pretty good. So now, before we can actually paint our final piece, we need to figure out which order we want the colors to go in. So often, when we're starting from one color and moving to the next, I like to go light to dark. So in that case, I think I'm gonna go wisteria is first, and then lavender, and then now I'm gonna do phthalo turquoise, and then perylene violet to end. So as one final test, let's put all of those together in a kind of gradient and see what the result is. So in order to do this, you need to have really wet paint. It can't be really streaky. And the way that you get really wet paint is by adding lots of water. So first I'm adding lots of water to my wisteria. And next I'm acting fast while the wisteria is still wet. I'm going to start in the wisteria and kind of blend outward with the lavender. And then add some at the end, making sure it's all still wet. And then to fully blend the wisteria and the lavender together, I'm just gonna do some manual work here. Manual blending means that after I've let them blend together naturally, I'm going back either with a clean brush or with more color on and just kind of blending them together like that. Just kind of helping them mix with each other when sometimes it can be tricky. Sometimes when you just let them blend together naturally, they don't do it as well as if you're using your brush to help it along. Okay, so now that I have the lavender, I'm going to get my phthalo turquoise. And the thing I'm going to do with my phthalo turquoise is it's pretty potent when I take it right off of my palette. So I'm just going to water it down just a little bit to make it very wet. And going to do the same thing here. Start away from the lavender and then let it meet, paint it into the lavender so the two colors meet each other. And that one looked like it blended pretty well, so I'm just going to use some water and tap along here to help it blend a little bit better, and maybe add just a little more phthalo turquoise and a little more lavender. Just kind of using my brush to help the blend along. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And now I'm just gonna re-wet the turquoise to make sure that it's wet enough for when I add the perylene violet. And for the perylene violet, I'm gonna do a similar thing that I did with the turquoise, just because it is a dark color also. Darker than the other two anyway. So I have it very wet, and now I'm going to finish off this blending color gradient by blending my perylene violet into the phthalo turquoise, and then do some manual blending like we did with the others over here. Picking up some turquoise color and some perylene violet and just helping them along. There's my color gradient for my Misty Forest, and it all looks like it'll blend pretty well to me. So that is the end of our color practicing session. Now on to practicing trees. Okay, so we know what colors we want to use. Now we just need to practice forming trees for a few minutes before we actually paint our final project. If you're interested in learning how to paint lots of different kinds of loose watercolor pine trees, I have a Skillshare class that goes over 8 different methods. But for this video, I'm gonna do a brief tutorial on one. It's probably my favorite method, and I like to call it the blobby technique. And I call it that because the way that you paint pine trees with the blobby technique is first, I'm using a size 6 brush here, and it's a professional grade, so the point is very thin at the top, which means I can use it to paint thin lines like this if I use only a little bit of pressure. But you can also use a smaller brush, like a size 0, if you're more comfortable with that. So first I'm painting the trunk, and then using my brush, like the full bristles of my brush, I'm basically painting blobs on either side of the trunk. And I'm doing that all the way down until I get to the bottom. The way that I like to paint pine trees is not by stopping. I know that some pine trees like stop 2/3 of the way down, but I like to go all the way down when I paint these loose pines, especially when I'm doing these Misty Forest ones. So one more time. That's a little wonky of a trunk, but I paint the trunk, and then using my brush, I just kind of paint on either side these blobs that kind of mimic the shape of the pine tree. And that is how I paint pine trees for these Misty Forest pieces. So before we end this practice session, definitely practice your pine trees, and I'm going to demonstrate one more time just so you can see. Now first, before I paint the tree, I'm going to do a little bit bigger version of the blobs over here. So using a size 6 brush, I start at the trunk, and then I push downward and kind of up or out, if that makes sense. So it's not like when you're using a paintbrush, it's easy if you push out to get like lines like that. And I'm not looking for thick lines, I'm looking for blobs. So one way to think about the way that you hold this brush is to push out and down, and then to the side and maybe up. And like you're trying to move your paintbrush around so that you can create these kind of misshapen blobs that will help to form this more abstract loose style pine tree. So and I don't pay much attention to exactly how the blobs are formed. I just kind of loosely know how I like to move my brush, and so that's why I recommend you experiment with your brush a lot to figure out how you like to move your brush. And your blobs, mind you, don't always have to happen all at once. You can paint part of it and then use your paintbrush to kind of fill in other parts, whatever you like. So one more time, I'm going to paint the trunk, and I'm going to start my pine trees. Also important to note is that I start them a little bit below the top so that the top is always pointy. I'm keeping the trunk pointy at the top. So I'm starting at a little bit below and painting the blobs in. And also important to note is that nature is not symmetrical usually. So I would go for, I really love imperfection and off-kilter trees. And I mean, but especially when you're painting them in a misty forest, they kind of all blend together at the end anyway. So mostly this is a caution. Just don't be too worried about how your trees look. Don't spend too much time making sure the composition is exactly right. The best way to get better at painting these loose style misty pines is to just paint them over and over again. And at some point, honestly, painting them becomes like muscle memory. That's kind of how it is for me. So there's the tutorial on pine trees. Again, if you want to learn how to paint lots of different kinds, this is just one of 8 different methods that I go over in my Loose Pine Skillshare class. Feel free to check that out. The link should be at the bottom here. But if not, if you're good with this, then let's truck forward on this video to finish our Misty Pines painting. So before we do anything, it's important to know where mist comes from. So if we're looking at this little Misty Forest painting that I have here, you see that our trees above are clear, defined, And from what we know about watercolor, that means I painted them using the wet on dry technique, which means that the paper was dry while the paint was wet, and so that's what allowed the trees to remain crisp and clear. But then when we hit the bottom of this ridge, all of the colors start blending together, and that means we used the wet on wet technique, which means that the paper underneath all these trees was wet when the paint met it, and that's how all the paint mixed together on the paper, because watercolor is activated by water. So when it comes into contact with water, instead of staying in a straight line or wherever your brush stroke is, it wants to go everywhere. So let's just see the wet on wet technique in action. Let's see what I mean by that. So I'm gonna paint with water, just a little swatch of water here, and then I'm gonna pick up some paint. And when I drop my paint in this swatch of water, you see how it just like goes everywhere, as opposed to on dry paper, when I do the same motion, it just stays in little dots. Like the paint only goes where my paintbrush goes, because the paint is the only thing that's wet and the paintbrush is the only thing allowing the water to move. So that's why watercolor paint moves along with the brush when the paper is dry. But when the paper is wet, as we can see up here, the paint wants to go every which way. And here I'm adding water, which is another technique when we finally paint the actual thing. Adding water to paint that's on wet paper is just another way to kind of blend everything together. So the motion that we're going to be using to paint these trees is, let's put some water down again, is basically we're gonna paint lines or the trunks of our trees up top and then let them hit the water at the bottom. And so the best way to practice for this style painting is to practice painting these lines, and then we're gonna learn how to paint trees in just a few minutes, but the trees are also going to meet the water. Painting lines and painting trees along the water's edge while the swatch of water is still wet enough that the paint is going to spread out like that. Okay, so practice that and practice the wet on wet technique, and let's move right on along. Okay, so we've practiced trees, we've picked out color palettes, we've practiced the wet on wet technique. Now is the main event. So for this video, we're going to do 2 different styles of these misty forests. The first is we're going to paint all of the colors right in a row, and then the second is going to look more like this style where some of the colors are mixed together, which we know will work well because when we did our color experiments, all of the colors mixed well together with each other. So first things first, step 1 is to use your brush, and actually I'm going to use a little bit of a bigger brush. That's a size 6 that I would normally use for to paint the trees. But I'm going to use, this is a size 12, just a bigger brush to paint my ridge. And if you can't see my brush stroke, I am not making it a straight line. I am making it a little bit wavy. And I'm doing a few different strokes so that there's plenty of wetness. I'm not going to go all the way down to the bottom. It's just going to be kind of floating in the middle of the paper. But I am going to leave some room on either side so that it does not go to the edge of the paper. And bear in mind that we may have to re-wet this at some point if we don't go quickly enough. But for now, this looks like it'll work. For reference, this is a Princeton Round number 12 Glacier series, and you can tell because of the clear handle. Okay, so we have the water, and next is to add the trees. Okay, so Here, we have painted our swatch of water, and next we're going to start painting the trees. I already know what order I want to paint them in because I decided that when I chose my colors, right? So I'm going to pick up some wisteria, and we want it to be very wet. So make sure that to put a lot of water wherever you are picking up your paint. And then I'm just going to start painting trees. So the key here is the small trunk, and I'm getting that using the point of my paintbrush to make sure you get that pointy top. That's what really makes it look like a pine tree. But also important is when painting forests or when looking at forests, the trees are definitely not all the same. They're not all the same size, they're not the same shape really. And so you want to bear in mind that you should paint several different sizes of trees, and they should have different levels of pine needles on them. So maybe this one I'll do like kind of a more sparse one that has a lot more spaces. And you also don't want to paint them so that they are exactly the same distance apart. Sometimes you want to have more distance between them. Sometimes you want them to be very close to each other. The key is to just not have anything be uniform. Okay, so I painted a few trees, and now I'm going to pick up my lavender, and I need to work quickly because I want all of this to still be wet. And I'm just gonna, like, right next to this wisteria, and even going into that tree, I'm gonna paint my lavender. And just to make sure this blends together well all the way, I'm gonna pick up some lavender and just kind of dot it at the bottom right there so that it blends together with the wisteria. So I'm gonna paint a few more lavender trees in the same way. And one more. Paying attention to the size so they're not all the same. And now, before I move on to turquoise, I'm going to just make sure that this is wet enough. So I might need to add a little bit more water. I'm also going to add some water along the bottom here because it just adds a fun texture, especially when blending these colors together. So, okay. Next, let's pick up some turquoise. Remember that the next two colors are a little more concentrated of pigments, and so we want to add lots of water to them so they're not dry when we paint with them. Okay, so get right up close next to that lavender tree. And I might need to do some manual blending over here because it looks like parts of these trees have dried already. And so just so there's not like a stark difference between the lavender and the turquoise, I'm just gonna manually blend a little bit by picking up some water and like tapping with my paintbrush like that. Having all of the colors blend together is really what makes these pieces look super cool. So a little bit more turquoise. Last one. And now I'm going to do violet, the perylene violet. Okay, right up next to this turquoise so that they blend together. Like that. And only a couple more, maybe 2 more trees. just a little one right there. Okay, so now I'm just gonna take some of this watercolor and just kind of bring some of this color down and blend it in with the water, and pick up some turquoise and do the same thing. Just blend it a little bit more with this Perylene Violet over here. There. And then with clean water, I'm just gonna go along the bottom and make sure that the colors are all blended into the water pretty well. And there you go. That's how you paint a line or like a gradient style Misty Forest, Misty Pines piece. So now you try. I want to see your color combinations and how you can come up with a Misty piece that looks just like this. And then finally, in the next part of the video, we're going to paint using the same color scheme, a Misty Forest piece that looks like this, with the colors all different and blended together. So that'll be fun too. Okay, so we have this gradient style Misty Forest, and now we're going to paint more of a mixed color style. So the steps are pretty much the same. First, we're going to paint our swatch of water underneath, knowing that there's a decent chance we're going to have to re-wet it maybe halfway through in some places. The difference is that we're not going to be going exactly from left to right, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. So the way that I like to paint these mixed color Misty Forests is one color at a time still, but then obviously just kind of varying the location of the color. So I'm going to start with wisteria, and typically I start on the side like this. So I'm going to paint my tree, a quick little tree, and then I'm going to paint like 4 or 5 more in various places along this ridge, and maybe they're next to each other like these two, or maybe they're very far away from each other. The key is to not have there be like a specific pattern, because again, we're going for, these are in nature, so they should be random. And that means that there's not really like a specific way that you paint them. And I mentioned that all the time when in my classes on landscapes and wilderness painting. I don't often sit down and think of this great composition, because wilderness painting is supposed to be random. Well, nature is not always in patterns. So, okay, there's wisteria. And remember, before we pick up lavender, or as I'm picking up lavender, I want these to be very wet. Remember that we already did a test of these colors together, right? And all of the different colors blended well together. And so there's no need to be really careful about which ones go where, because we're not going to get mud or brown regardless of what color combinations there are. And that is a really important aspect to keep in mind whenever painting anything like this. Okay. So I'm painting some lavender, and notice that my wisteria trees have already really started to dry, so that's important to note. I think that's enough lavender for right now. Before I go on, I'm going to pick up clean water with my brush and just kind of re-wet the area while also doing some manual blending of these trees over here. So I'm simultaneously manually blending some of these colors together while also re-wetting the ridgeline. So when I continue painting, I'm not going to have any dried paint lines. Okay, next is turquoise. And I'm going to do some turquoise together like that. And then maybe over here. I'm just kind of wherever my eyes go, maybe in between these two, that's where I'm going. I don't really have a rhyme or reason. And if some of these trees have dried, and like see this turquoise tree has kind of overtaken this wisteria tree, that's okay. It just adds layer and texture to it. So don't worry too much about that, because it's just going to make the painting even more quirky and fun. Okay, and now we're gonna finish with our Perylene Violet. And it looks like there's definitely some spots in between, in the middle over here, where we can add a couple of Perylene Violet trees. And maybe right here. And maybe right here. Make this one a little taller. And I'm gonna go back and manually blend in a lot of these. So if you're looking and noticing that the blends aren't going well together, don't worry, I'm gonna fix that. So, okay, I've added some violet trees, and now I'm gonna clean off my brush. Not too much water, but not too much paint either, and just kind of manually blend a lot of these together, like that, to get rid of any lines or anything like that. And then I'm going to pick up some watery parts of every color and just kind of briefly color in some of the spots along the bottom here, because I want every color to be represented, and especially like wisteria and lavender have probably disappeared a little bit because they were the first layers to go on. So I'm just kind of painting in some of these colors that have disappeared so that we don't lose them. And then doing a little bit of the turquoise and Perylene Violet also, because we want all of these colors represented in this mixture forest that we have going on. And then, so once I have a bunch of the colors there, now I'm just gonna, with a clean brush, kind of do some of the manual work again to make sure that there aren't like some stark blends, to make sure that they all really go well together. And then I'm gonna go along the bottom and just kind of blend along the bottom to make sure that they all blend in with the paper really nicely as well. Okay, so there you have it. Two different versions of a line of Misty Forest, or ridge of Misty Forest, I guess. Using the same color palette, but two different kinds. So the first was this gradient style that we did, and the next was this mixed blending style that we did, and they are both some of my very favorite methods for painting these forests. So I can't wait to see what you come up with. Make sure to, if you post these on Instagram, to tag me. My handle is thiswritingdesk, and you may just be featured in my stories. So thanks again for joining me today for this quick loose style line of Misty Forests, and I will see you next time.